EVO. Welcome back to the Ides of April. This is The Scholar and the Madman, the assassination of President James A. Garfield. So episode 1 of this will be dropped on the Ides of April feed as well as the Devil Within feed, whereas part 2 will only be available on the Ides of April feed. So if you're listening to this on the Devil Within, I would ask to please head on over to the Ides of April and give me a follow over there. It would help more people discover the show. So, with that said, let's dive in. I onward go. I stop, with hinged knees and steady hand to dress wounds. I am faithful. I do not give out. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. Here it's Walt Whitman. He kneels beside the broken with a gentleness that belongs to the saints, not the surgeons. His is the hand that trembles with compassion, that understands the sacredness of suffering, the fragility of the body in its hour of need. But when we step into the summer of 1881, when we place James Garfield onto a bed lit by half-drawn curtains and the murmuring confidence of the men who called themselves physicians, we discover something far from Whitman's vision. For the wound dressers and Garfield's story, they don't soothe, they probe, they insist. They believe certainty grants immunity from error. And it is in that widening distance between Whitman's tenderness and the century's arrogance that our tragedy begins. Chapter 1. A Republic Between Breaths. America in 1881 was a country speaking with two voices. One proclaimed progress, with railroads binding coasts together and telegraph lines blinking across the prairies, factories rising like monuments to the new country. The other voice whispered uncertainty, a lingering tremor from the Civil War, a political system that had replaced policy with patronage, and a public that sensed the nation was still more scaffolding than structure. Walk through Washington on any humid summer morning and you would see the contradiction plainly. Marble buildings glowing with the promise of permanence, while inside them, governors, senators, clerks, and power brokers, they exchanged favors with the casual precision of pickpockets. The spoils system ruled everything. If you wanted a postmastership in Missouri, a customs job in New York, an ambassadorship to France, you didn't apply. You aligned. You pledged yourself to a faction. You learned how to bow and strike in the same motion. The Republican Party was the epicenter of the storm. The stalwarts, led by the towering, self-anointed emperor of New York politics, Roscoe Conkling, believed that patronage was the oxygen of governance. Then there were the half-breeds, the moderate reformers who were only half-reformed themselves. They argued that the spoils system was chewing the republic into pieces. Both sides were convinced of their righteousness. Both sides were wrong in their own ways. But both sides were also waiting for a man to lead them. James Abram Garfield was not that man. Not at first, and certainly not by intent. He was born in a log cabin in Ohio. His early years read like an American parable written with exquisite earnestness. A widowed mother, a boy who hauled freight on a canal boat, a mind sharper than the tools he labored with. He taught himself Greek and Latin. He became a professor at 26, a college president at 28, a Union general by the middle of the Civil War, and a congressman who carried poetry in his breast pocket and an entire political calculus in his head. But he didn't hunger for the presidency. If anything, he feared the distortion that it demanded. But destiny, or maybe its messier cousin called political chaos, had other plans. The Republican National Convention of 1880 was less a political gathering and more a controlled burn. Conkling's stalwarts demanded Ulysses S. Grant for an unprecedented third term. The half-breeds rallied behind the brilliant but scandal-shadowed James G. Blaine. The ballots stacked like cordwood, 10, 20, 30, each one a testament to the party's fractured spine. But then, on the 36th ballot, something strange happened. A name appeared. Garfield. Whispered at first, then spoken, then shouted as if conjured by desperation itself. He hadn't campaigned. He hadn't asked. He hadn't even considered the possibility. When the tally was announced, Garfield rose slowly, as though gravity had doubled around him. His friend said his face carried two expressions at once: humility and dread. For unlike those who clawed their way toward office, Garfield understood the weight of it. The way a single decision could alter thousands of lives. The way the Republic could tilt under the pressure of poor judgment. And yet, he accepted. Duty required it. History demanded it. But even as Garfield took office, a quiet shadow stretched behind him. One that no campaign speech, no cabinet appointment, no policy compromise could dispel. It was the same shadow that haunted Longfellow decades earlier when he wrote of death as a reaper gathering the innocent with sorrowful eyes. He gazed at flowers with tearful eyes. He kissed their drooping leaves. Garfield, sitting in the soft lamplight of the executive mansion, reading state reports and letters from his children, couldn't know how close that shadow already stood. He had entered a presidency remarkable not for its controversies, but for its promise. He wanted civil service reform. He wanted education expansion. He wanted a calmer, steadier republic. But the spoils system, the beast he hoped to tame, was already gnashing its teeth. Conklin, enraged that his machine no longer controlled the New York Custom House, plotted revenge. Senators whispered betrayal. Cabinet members steered loyalties like ships in fog. The new president found himself surrounded by men who interpreted compromise as weakness and principle as inconvenience. And somewhere in Washington, in cheap boarding houses with peeling wallpaper, in cafes where he nursed a single cup of coffee for hours, another man watched Garfield's every move with a fascination bordering on the divine. A man who believed God spoke to him. A man who believed Garfield owed him glory. A man who believed history had chosen him for an act of unparalleled importance. The Republic was inhaling, the century was shifting, and the fateful collision, president and assassin, was already drawing near. Chapter 2. The man who believed God owed him an ambassadorship. Charles Julius Guiteau arrived in Washington the way a storm arrives over a warm field. Unnoticed at first, then unsettling, then impossible to ignore. He came with one small valise, a handful of self-published religious tracts, and a confidence so unwarranted it bordered on the sublime. No resume, no credentials, no reputation to speak of. Only the unwavering conviction that God had stitched greatness directly into the lining of his coat. Washington, a city already accustomed to eccentrics and opportunists, did not immediately recognize him as dangerous. In truth, he blended into the political underbrush with alarming ease. The boarding houses of the capital were full of men who believed themselves destined for ambassadorships, who loitered in hotel lobbies waiting to clasp hands with senators, who wrote uninvited recommendations on elegant stationery and slipped them under locked doors. Guiteau was only slightly stranger than the average political hopeful, at least at first glance. His history, however, told a very different story. It seems Guiteau had failed at everything he touched, as if his hands were made of smoke. He failed at preaching. He was too shrill, too theatrical, too fond of sermonizing on subjects even congregants didn't care about. Next, he failed at law, famously losing cases he had declared unlosable with an optimism so deranged it practically glowed. Then he failed at marriage. His wife left him after he chased her around a boarding house with a fireplace poker. He even failed at communal living. The Oneida community, which tolerated almost any eccentricity, finally ousted him for laziness, arrogance, and a persistent, unnerving smile. Yet through all of this, Guiteau held on to an almost supernatural belief in his own destiny. He believed himself a prophet, a visionary, a man who could change the course of the Republic simply by being present at the right moment with the right declaration. Then Garfield won the presidency. And in Guiteau's mind, that victory hadn't been the will of delegates, or the result of political fatigue after 36 ballots, or the final compromise of a fractured convention. No, it was his doing. Guiteau had written a speech titled Garfield versus Hancock, a document so incoherent that anyone who saw it assumed it was satire or the work of someone recovering from a head injury. He delivered it once, in a dingy hall barely filled past the first row. No one clapped, no one remembered it, no newspaper reprinted a word of it. But Guiteau believed it had turned the tide of the election. He believed the Republic owed him gratitude. He believed Garfield owed him a reward. And so he began appearing almost daily at the White House and at the State Department, asking for what he believed to be the only reasonable compensation for his pivotal political contribution, the ambassadorship to Paris. Why Paris? Because in Guiteau's mind, it fit him. Paris was beautiful, Paris was grand, Paris was full of audiences who would appreciate a man of his intellect. Day after day, he pressed letters into the hands of secretaries and clerks, letters that began with faux humility and crescendoed into declarations of destiny. He buttonholed cabinet members. He cornered James Blaine, Garfield's Secretary of State, so often that Blaine eventually hissed at him, "Do not ever speak to me again about the Paris consulship." To Guiteau, this wasn't rejection. This was persecution. Confirmation that the devil opposed the divine mission he believed himself to be carrying out. This is the precise moment when madness, long simmering beneath his ribcage, began to boil. And it's here, at the hinge between delusion and intention, that the great Walt Whitman's voice slips back into the room, bearing its heavy twilight. O powerful western stars, O shades of night, O moody, tearful night. Whitman understood the dread that arrives before the tragedy. The way darkness pools at a nation's feet long before its people understand what they're stepping into. And in the months before July 2nd, 1881, that darkness grew thicker. Not in the White House, not in Congress, but in the small, overheated boarding rooms where Guiteau lay awake at night. Convinced angels were whispering instructions in his ear. By May, Guiteau had resolved that Garfield must die. Not out of hatred. No, hatred requires emotional attachment, and Guiteau felt nothing so ordinary. He believed Garfield's death would save the Republic, would unite the factions of the Republican Party, elevate Chester A. Arthur to the presidency, and earn Guiteau eternal fame. God, he insisted, had commanded it. So the assassination wouldn't be murder. It was simply political destiny. Guiteau purchased a revolver, a British Bulldog .44. He chose the ivory-handled one because he thought it would look better in a museum display. He practiced at shooting galleries where children played. He rehearsed addresses to the American people, explaining why Garfield's removal would usher in a golden age. He wrote letters announcing his own righteousness to be mailed after the deed. He stalked the president at church, at the train depot, at the home of a sick relative. 3 different times he prepared to fire, but 3 times he balked because the scene didn't feel historic enough. On July 2nd, The Baltimore and Potomac train station, with its mosaic floors, its iron arches, and echoing chambers, finally matched the vision in his mind. A stage worthy of his delusion. A moment worthy of his fantasy. And as Garfield, in good spirits, walked into that station beside Secretary Blaine, chatting about a trip to Massachusetts, Guiteau stepped behind him with the serenity of an executioner who believes he's performing a public service. Everything that followed belonged to the next chapter. The shots, the collapse, the president carried away in disbelief, the assassin smiling as he claimed divine credit. For now, all we need to know is this. In the weeks leading up to that morning, one man grew increasingly presidential, rising into the office that he never sought. And another man, trembling with feverish certainty, believed he was about to become the most important American alive. History was preparing its duel, and both combatants were already walking toward the appointed hour.
Our dogs are family, and they deserve food that treats them that way. That's why Ollie makes meals with fresh, human-grade ingredients you can actually recognize. Chicken, beef, carrots, blueberries, spinach, no fillers, no byproducts, just real nutrition slow-cooked to keep your pup healthy and energized. Shinier coats, better digestion, more energy, and with 5 protein-packed flavors like beef with sweet potatoes or turkey with blueberries, your dog may be eating better than you. Every plan is customized to your dog's age, breed, and activity level, and delivered right to your door in perfectly portioned, easy-to-serve packs. Simple, fresh, and made just for them. Now here's how you can try it. Your dog's well-being starts with their food, and that's why Ollie delivers fresh, human-grade food that your dog will love. Head to ollie.com/IDES. Tell them all about your dog and use code IDES to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/IDES and enter code IDES to get 60% off your first box. Most people can't name every financial account they have or what any of them are really worth. A 401k here, an old brokerage there, a few credit cards, maybe a forgotten savings account. It's a kind of financial fog, and it's costing people money. Monarch cuts through that fog. It's an all-in-one personal finance platform that brings your entire financial life together, cleanly, clearly, and instantly on your laptop or your phone. Link your accounts in minutes, see where your money's actually going, and take control of it. Monarch does the heavy lifting. Smart categorization, powerful visuals, and planning tools trusted by professionals. It's been named Best Budgeting App of 2025 by the Wall Street Journal, Forbes' Best App for Couples, and listed among CNBC's top fintech companies in the world. Don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code IDES at monarch.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code IDES.
Chapter 3. The Morning the Republic Stood Still. The Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station was one of those grand, Gilded Age contradictions, beautiful in its way, but built with an undercurrent of chaos. Iron arches stretched like ribs overhead, light spilled in through great panes of glass, striking the mosaic tiled floors and warming the crowds that surged in and out like tide water. Train whistles pierced the morning air, porters shouted, baggage carts rattled past carrying the luggage of senators and diplomats and families heading north for the summer. It was July 2nd, 1881, humid already at an early hour, with the air of Washington City hanging thick with the kind of heat that makes coats feel heavy and tempers get really short. President James Garfield arrived in unusually fine spirits, walking with a confident, relaxed stride. He was traveling to reunite with his wife, Lucretia, who had spent the previous weeks recovering from illness along the New Jersey coast. Garfield had been worried about her, and the thought of seeing her again gave him a buoyancy that staff later recalled with bittersweet clarity. Beside him walked his friend and Secretary of State James Blaine, who spoke with animated gestures. Blaine was a man constructed entirely of sharp lines, sharp intellect, sharp features, sharp political instincts. And yet, in Garfield's company, he softened. Their friendship was the kind of partnership that reshapes presidencies. And as they crossed the station's polished floor, they looked, for one fleeting moment, like the leaders of a nation whose battles were finally settling down. But the Republic wasn't at peace. And although no one saw it, danger stood in the station long before the president did. Charles Guiteau had arrived early, hours early. He'd chosen his clothes with theatrical care. A dark coat despite the heat, a glint of perspiration already forming at his hairline. The ivory-handled revolver, the one he believed future generations would admire in the Smithsonian, was tucked into his pocket. He paced the station like a man waiting for a friend he was eager to impress. His hands trembled, but not with fear, with excitement. He watched every doorway, every person of importance, every uniform. And then he saw them. Garfield and Blaine, walking with the casual confidence of men who had no reason to fear their fellow countrymen. Blaine recognized a station worker and raised a hand in greeting. Garfield smiled, his eyes lighting with the warm, open expression that made strangers trust him. Guiteau stepped from the column where he'd been waiting. His breathing steadied, his palms dried. Every delusional prophecy he'd whispered to himself suddenly crystallized into a single, perfect moment. This is the hour God has chosen for me. Garfield's back was turned. He never heard the footsteps. He never saw the barrel of the gun rise. 2 shots. One grazed his arm, the other entered his back and tore through the soft geography of his torso. The sound cracked through the station like lightning. Women screamed, men ducked instinctively. Garfield stumbled forward, surprise crossing his face before his knees buckled. He collapsed in a heap against the stone curb of the luggage area, gasping, tasting dust and blood, confusion filling his eyes as he tried to understand what had happened. Blaine wheeled around, horror ripping across his face. He dropped to his knees beside Garfield and cried out for help, his voice cutting through the station like a clarion. For a moment, the Secretary of State looked far older than his years, broken open by fear for the man he admired. Guiteau didn't flee, he didn't run, he didn't even try. He slipped the revolver into his pocket and walked toward the exit with a serene expression, as though he had just concluded a difficult but necessary task. When a bystander tackled him, Guiteau cried, not in pain but in irritation, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. Arthur is president now. It is God's will." The crowd nearly tore him apart before police dragged him away. Mothers shielded their children. Men shouted for justice. One woman spit on him. Guiteau, glowing with the fever of righteousness, asked the officers if they would deliver his explanation letter to the White House. Back inside, Garfield lay on the station floor, blood pooling around him, his vision tunneling. He whispered to Blaine, "My God, what is this?" But even as he said it, he already knew. Blaine begged with him to stay conscious. Others rushed to lift him. A doctor, if you could call him that, insisted that they immediately probe the wound with their dirty train station hands. It was as though the centuries' science and superstition had collided in real time, and Garfield's body was the battleground. And through all this madness, the screams, the scrambling feet, the blurred faces, Garfield experienced a moment of strange clarity. In later accounts from witnesses, it was said that he looked almost peaceful for a heartbeat, as though he had recognized something one of his favorite poets, again, the great Walt Whitman, had once named. Quote, "The real war will never get in the books." This assassination, this rupture in the American story, it wasn't just political. It was spiritual. It tore open the fault lines of a country still learning how to stand upright after the Civil War, still learning how to govern itself without corruption, still learning how fragile a president could be. Garfield would live for 79 more days. He would endure agony that no man could survive. He would suffer not because of the bullet, but because of the arrogance of the doctors who swarmed around him. But that chapter, his slow undoing, the vigil of a nation, the medical hubris that turned wounding into execution, that belongs to part 2. For now, the Republic had collapsed into a single terrible moment. Its president was carried out of a train station. The assassin was declaring divine glory, and its people, stunned, frightened, and suddenly aware of how thin the membrane between order and chaos truly was. And so ends the first act of the tragedy. Garfield rising into a presidency he never sought, Guiteau descending into madness he believed was prophecy, and the nation caught in the crosswind of both men's destinies. Next week in part 2, we enter the sick room, the fumbling hands of doctors who mistook confidence for knowledge, the slow extinguishing of a good man's life, and the trial of the assassin who mistook delusion for divine mandate. This great republic held its breath for 79 days, and when it exhaled, it was changed forever. If this episode moved you, please follow, rate, and review The Ides of April. Your support brings the next story to life and helps keep long-form historical storytelling alive across the EVO Creative Network. Explore more at evocreative.com and follow us on Instagram at The Ides of April Pod. And please consider supporting the great companies that support our show. Ollie, fresh human-grade dog food. Go to ollie.com/Ides for 60% off your first box. And Monarch, the modern way to manage your finances. Monarch.com/Ides for 50% off your first year. And if you're listening to this on The Devil Within, please head over to the Ides of April feed on Apple or Spotify or wherever you're listening and follow the Ides of April. We'll see you next week with part 2. Thanks for listening.